Ego and Archetype by Edinger. Part 1. Individuation and the Stages of Development. And if it is true that we acquired our knowledge before our birth and lost it at the moment of birth, but afterward, by the exercise of our senses upon sensible objects, recovered the knowledge which we once had before, I suppose that what we call learning will be the recovery of our own knowledge. Plato. Chapter 1. The Inflated Ego. The sun will not overstep his measures. If he does, the Erinyes, the handmaids of justice, will find him out. Heraclitus. 1. Ego and Self. Jung's most basic and far-reaching discovery is the collective unconscious, or archetypal psyche. Through his researches, we now know that the individual psyche is not just a product of personal experience. It also has a pre-personal or transpersonal dimension which is manifested in universal patterns and images such as are found in all worlds, religions, and mythologies. It was Jung's further discovery that the archetypal psyche has a structuring or ordering principle which unifies the various archetypal contents. This is the central archetype or archetype of wholeness which Jung has termed the self. The self is the ordering and unifying center of the total psyche, conscious and unconscious, just as the ego is the center of the conscious personality. Or put in other words, the ego is the seat of subjective identity, while the self is the seat of objective identity. The self is thus the supreme psychic authority and subordinates the ego to it. The self is most simply described as the inner empirical deity and is identical with the imago Dei. Jung has demonstrated that the self has a characteristic of phenomenology. It is expressed by certain typical symbolic images called mandalas. All images that emphasize a circle with a center and usually with an addition feature of a square, a cross, or some other representation of quaternity fall into this category. There are also a number of other associated themes and images that refer to the self. Such themes as wholeness, totality, the union of opposites, the central generative point, the world navel, the axis of the universe, the creative point where God and man meet, the point where transpersonal energies flow into personal life, eternity as opposed to the temporal flux, incorruptibility, the inorganic united paradoxically with the organic, protective structures capable of bringing order out of chaos, the transformation of energy, the elixir of life, all refer to the self, the central source of life energy, the fountain of our being which is most simply described as God. Indeed, the richest sources for the phenomenological study of the self are the innumerable representations that man has made of the deity. Since there are two autonomous centers of psychic being, the relation between the two centers becomes vitally important. The ego's relation to the self is a highly problematic one, and corresponds very closely to man's relation to his creator, as depicted in religious myth. Indeed, the myth can be seen as a symbolic expression of the ego-self relationship. Many of the vicissitudes of psychological development can be understood in terms of the changing relation between ego and self at various stages of psychic growth. It is this progressive evolution of the ego-self relation which I propose to examine. Jung originally described the phenomenology of the self as it occurs in the individuation process during the second half of life. More recently, we have begun to consider the role of the self in the early years of life. Newman, on the basis of mythological and ethnographical material, has depicted symbolically the original psychic state prior to the birth of ego consciousness as the Ouroboros, using the circular image of the tail eater to represent the primordial self, the original mandala state of totality out of which the individual ego is born. Fordham, on the basis of clinical observations of infants and children, has also postulated the self as the original totality prior to the ego. It is generally accepted among analytical psychologists that the task of the first half of life involves ego development with the progressive separation between ego and self, whereas the second half of life requires a surrender or at least a relativization of the ego as it experiences and relates to the self. The current working formula, therefore, is first half of life, ego self-separation, second half of life, ego self-reunion. This formula, although perhaps true as a broad generality, neglects many empirical observations made in child psychology and in the psychotherapy of adults. According to these observations, a more nearly correct formula would be a circular one, which would be diagrammed thus: ego self-separation into ego self-union, and ego self-union into ego self-separation. The process of alternation between ego self-union and ego self-separation seems to occur repeatedly through the life of the individual, both in childhood and in maturity. Indeed, this cyclical, or better spiral, formula seems to express the basic process of psychological development from birth to death. According to this view, the relation between the ego and self at different stages of development could be represented by the following diagrams. Figure 1, an ego within inside the self. Figure 2, an ego outside of the self, partially outside of the self, an ego 3/4 outside of the self, and an ego fully outside of the self. These diagrams represent progressive states of ego self-separation appearing in the course of psychological development. The shaded ego areas designate the residual ego self-identity. This line connecting ego center with the self center represents the ego self-axis, the vital connecting link between ego and self that ensures the integrity of the ego. It should be understood that these diagrams were designed to illustrate a particular point and are thus inaccurate in other respects. For example, we generally define the self as the totality of the psyche, which would necessarily include the ego. According to these diagrams and to the method of this presentation, it would seem as though the ego and self became two separate entities, the ego being the smaller lump and the self the larger lump of the totality. This difficulty is inherent in the subject matter. If we speak rationally, we must inevitably make a distinction between ego and self which contradicts our definition of self. The fact is, the conception of the self is a paradox. It is simultaneously the center and the circumference of the circle of totality. Considering ego and self as two separate entities is merely a necessary rational device for discussing these things. Figure 1 corresponds to Newman's original Ouroboros state. Nothingness exists but the self mandala. The ego germ is present only as a potentiality. Ego and self are one, which means that there is no ego. This is the total state of primary ego self-identity. Figure 2 shows an emerging ego which is beginning to separate from the self, but which still has its center and greater area in primary identity with the self. Figure 3 presents a more advanced stage of the development. However, a residual ego self-identity still remains. The ego self-axis, which in the first two diagrams was completely unconscious and therefore indistinguishable from ego self-identity, has now become partially conscious. Figure 4 is an ideal theoretical limit which probably does not exist in actuality. It represents a total separation of ego and self, and a complete consciousness of the ego self-axis. These diagrams are designed to illustrate the thesis that psychological development is characterized by two processes occurring simultaneously, namely, progressive ego self-separation and also increasing emergence of the ego self-axis into consciousness. If this is a correct representation of the facts, it means that ego self-separation and growing consciousness of the ego as a dependent on the self are actually two aspects of a single emergent process continuous from birth to death. On the other hand, our diagrams also demonstrate the general validity of assigning awareness of the relativity of the ego to the second half of life. If we take figure 3 to correspond to middle age, we see that only at this stage has the upper portion of the ego self-axis begun to emerge into consciousness. The process by which these developmental stages unfold is an alternating cycle which is represented in the diagram 5 on page 41. As this cycle repeats itself again and again throughout psychic development, it brings about a progressive differentiation of the ego and the self. In the early phases, representing approximately the first half of life, the cycle is experienced as an alternation between two states of being, namely inflation and alienation. Later, a third stage appears when the ego-self axis reaches consciousness, which is characterized by a conscious dialectic relationship between ego and self. This stage is individuation. In this chapter, we shall consider the first stage, inflation. 2. Inflation and original wholeness. The dictionary definition of inflation is, quote, blown up, distended with air, unrealistically large, and unrealistically important, beyond the limits of one's proper size, hence, to be vain, pompous, proud, presumptuous. Close quote. I use the term inflation to describe the attitude and the state which accompanies the identification of the ego with the self. It is a state in which something small, the ego, has arrogated to itself the qualities of something larger, the self, and hence is blown up beyond the limits of its proper size. We are born in a state of inflation. In earliest infancy, no ego or consciousness exists. All is in the unconscious. The latent ego is in complete identification with the self. The self is born, but the ego is made, and in the beginning all is self. This state is described by Newman as the Ouroboros, the tail-eating serpent. Since the self is the center and totality of being, and the ego totally identified with the self experience itself as a deity, we can put in these terms retrospectively, although, of course, the infant does not think in this way. He cannot yet think at all, but his total being and experience are ordered around the a priori assumption of deity. This is the original state of unconscious wholeness and perfection which is responsible for the nostalgia we all have toward our origins, both personal and historical. Many myths depict the original state of man as a state of roundness, wholeness, perfection, or paradise. For instance, there is the Greek myth recorded by Hesiod of the four ages of man. The first original age was the Golden Age, a paradise. The second was the Silver Age, a matriarchal period where men obeyed their mothers. The third age was Bronze, a period of wars. And the fourth age was the Iron Age, the period of which he was writing, which was utterly degenerate. About the Golden Paradise Age, Hesiod says, quote, the golden race of men lived like gods, without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil and grief. They had all good things, for the fruitful earth unforced bore them fruit abundantly and without stint. They dwelt in ease and peace upon their lands with many good things, rich in flocks and loved by the blessed gods. Close quote. In the Paradise Age, the people are in union with the gods. This represents the state of the ego that is as yet unborn, not yet separated from the womb of the unconscious, and hence still partaking of the divine fullness and totality. Another example is the Platonic myth of original man. According to this myth, the original man was round in the shape of a mandala. In the Symposium, Plato says, the primeval man was round, his back and sides forming a circle. Terrible was their might and strength, and the thoughts of their hearts were great. And they made an attack upon the gods, and would have laid hands upon the gods. The gods could not suffer their insolence to go unrestrained. Here the inflated, arrogant attitude is particularly evident. Being round in the initial period of existence is equivalent to assuming oneself to be total and complete, and hence a god that can do all things. There is an interesting parallel between the myth of the original round man and Rode Kalag's studies of preschool art. She has observed that the mandala or circle image seems to be the predominant one in young children who are first learning how to draw. Initially, a 2-year-old with pencil or crayon just scribbles, but soon he sees to be attracted by the intersection of lines and begins to make crosses. Then the cross is enclosed by a circle, and we have the basic pattern of the mandala. As the child attempts to do human figures, they first emerge as circles, contrary to all visual experience, with the arms and legs being represented only as ray-like extensions of the circle. These studies provide clear empirical data indicating that the young children experiences the human being as a round mandala-like structure and verify in an impressive way the psychological truth of Plato's myth of the original round man. Child therapists also find the mandala an operative, healing image in young children. All of this indicates that, symbolically speaking, the human psyche was originally round, whole, complete, in a state of oneness and self-sufficiency that is equivalent to a deity itself. The same archetypal idea that connects childhood with nearness to deity is presented in Wordsworth's Ode on Intimations of Immortality. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life star, hath elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar. Not entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come. From God, who is our home, heaven lies about us in our infancy. From the standpoint of later years, the close connection of the child's ego with divinity in a state of inblation. Many subsequent psychological difficulties are due to residues of the identification with deity. Consider, for instance, the psychology of the child in the first 5 years or so. On one hand, it is a time of great freshness of perception and response. The child is in immediate contact with the archetypal realities of life. It is in the stage of original poetry. Magnificent and terrifying transpersonal powers are lurking in every commonplace event. But on the other hand, the child can be an egotistical little beast, full of cruelty and greed. Freud described the state of childhood as a polymorphous perversion. This is a brutal description, but it is at least partially true. Childhood, childhood is innocent, but it is also irresponsible. Hence, it has all the ambiguities of being firmly connected with the archetypal psyche and its extrapersonal energy, and at the same time being unconsciously identified with it and unrealistically related to it. Children share with the primitive man with the identification of ego with the archetypal psyche and ego with outer world. With primitives, inner and outer are not at all distinguished. For the civilized mind, primitives are most attractively related to nature and in tune with the life processes. But they are also savages and fall into same mistakes of inflation as do children. Modern man, alienated from the source of life meaning, finds the image of the primitive an object of yearning. This accounts for the appeal of Rousseau's concept of the noble savage, and other more recent works which express the civilized mind's nostalgia for its lost mystical communion with nature. This is one side, but there is also the negative side. The real of the primitive is dirty, degrading, and obsessed with terror. We would not want that reality for a moment. It is the symbolic primitive for which we would yearn. When one looks back on the psychological origin, it has twofold connotation. First, it is seen as a condition of paradise, wholeness, a state of being at once with nature and the gods, and infinitely desirable. But secondly, by our conscious human standards, which are related to time and space, reality, it is an inflated state, a condition of irresponsibility, unregenerate lust, arrogance, and crude desirousness. The basic problem for the adult is not to achieve the union with nature and the gods, with which the child starts, without bringing about the inflation of identification. The same question applies to the problems of child rearing. How can we successfully remove the child from his inflated state and give him a realistic and responsible notion of his relation to the world, while at the same time maintaining that living link with the archetypal psyche which is needed in order to make his personality strong and resilient? The problem is to maintain the integrity of the ego-self axis while dissolving the ego's identification with the self. On this question rest all disputes of permissiveness versus discipline in child rearing. Permissiveness emphasizes acceptance and encouragement of the child's spontaneity and nourishes his contact with the source of life energy which he is born. but it also maintains and encourages the inflation of the child, which is unrealistic to the demands of outer life. Discipline, on the other hand, emphasizes strict limits of behavior, encourages dissolution of the ego self-identity, and treats the inflation quite successfully. But at the same time, it tends to damage the vital, necessary connection between the growing ego and its roots in the unconscious. There is no choice between these, they are a pair of opposites, and must operate together. The child experiences himself quite literally as the center of the universe. The mother at first answers that demand, hence the initial relationship tends to encourage the child's feeling that its wish is the world's command, and it is absolutely necessary that this be so. If the constant and total commitment of the mother to the child's need is not experienced, the child cannot develop psychologically. However, before long the world necessarily begins to reject the infant's demands. At this, the original inflation begins to dissolve, being untenable in the face of experience. But also, alienation begins. The ego self-axis is damaged. A kind of unhealing psychic wound is created in the process of learning he is not the deity he thought he was. He is exiled from paradise, and permanent wounding and separation occur. Repeated experiences of alienation continue progressively right into adult life. One is constantly encountering a twofold process. On the one hand, we are exposed to the reality encounters which life provides and which are constantly contradicting unconscious ego assumptions. This is how the ego grows and separates from its unconscious identity with the self. At the same time, we must have recurring reunion between ego and self in order to maintain the integrity of the total personality. Otherwise, there's a real danger that as ego is separated from self, the vital connecting link between them will be damaged. If this happens to a serious extent, we are alienated from the depths of ourselves and the ground is prepared for psychological illness. The original state of affairs, experiencing oneself as the center of the universe, can persist long past childhood. For instance, I recall a young man who thought quite naively, "The world is my picture book." All the things he encountered he thought were put there for his purposes, for his amusement or his instruction. He quite literally considered the world to be his oyster. External experiences had no inherent reality or meaning except they related to him. Another patient had the conviction that which he died the world would come to an end. In the state of mind that generates such an idea, identification with the self is also identification with the world. Self and world are coextensive. This way of experiencing things does have a certain truth, a genuine validity, but it is a viewpoint which is absolutely poisoned in the early phases of development when the ego is trying to emerge from the original wholeness. Much later in life, the realization that there is a continuity between the inner and outer worlds can have a healing effect. Here is one more example of the Mercurius of the alchemists, who may be the panacea to some and poison to others. Many psychoses illustrate the identification of the ego with the self as the center of the universe, or the supreme principle. For instance, the common delusion among the insane that one is Christ or Napoleon is best explained as a regression to the original infantile state where the ego is identified with the self. Ideas of reference are also symptoms of extreme ego self-identity. In such cases, the individual imagines that certain objective events have a hidden relationship to himself. If he is paranoid, the delusion will be of persecuting nature. For example, I remember a patient who saw men fixing the wires on a telephone pole outside her apartment window. She interpreted this as evidence that a wiretapping device was being installed to eavesdrop on her telephone calls and thus get evidence against her. Another patient thought that the news commentator on a television was conveying a private message to him. Such delusions derive from a state of ego self-identity which assumes that oneself is the center of the universe and hence attaches private significance to outer events which are in fact totally indifferent to one's existence. A commonplace of the inflated state of ego self-identity is provided by H.G. Baynes as called the provisional life. Baynes describes the state as follows. The provisional life denotes an attitude that is innocent of responsibility towards the circumstantial facts of reality, as though these facts are being provided for either by the parents or the state, or at least by Providence. It is a state of childish irresponsibility and dependence. M.L. von Franz describes the same condition as an identification with the puer aeternus image. For such a person, what he is doing, quote, is not yet what is really wanted, and there is always the fantasy that sometime in the future the real thing will come about. If this attitude is prolonged, it means a constant inner refusal to commit oneself to the moment. With this, there is often, to a smaller or greater extent, a savior complex, or a messiah complex, with the secret thought that one day one will be able to save the world. The last word in philosophy, or religion, or politics, or art, or something else will be found. This can go so far as to be typical pathological megalomania, or there may be minor traces of it in the idea that one's time has not yet come. The one thing dreaded throughout by such a type of man is to be bound to anything whatever. There is a terrific fear of being pinned down, of entering space and time completely, and of being the one human being that one is. The psychotherapist frequently sees cases of this sort. Such a person considers himself as a most promising individual. He is full of talents and potentialities. One of his complaints is often that his capacities and interests are too wide-ranging. He is cursed with a plethora of riches. He could do anything but can't decide on one thing in particular. The problem is that he is all promises and no fulfillment. In order to make a real accomplishment, he must sacrifice a number of other potentialities. He must give up his identification with the original unconscious wholeness and voluntarily accept being a real fragment instead of an unreal whole. To be something in reality, he must give up being everything in potentia. The puer aeternus archetype is one of the images of the self, but to be identified with it means that one never brings any reality to birth. There are numerous lesser examples of inflation, which we might call inflation of everyday life. We can identify a state of inflation whenever we see someone, including ourselves, living out an attribute of deity, whenever one is transcending proper human limits. Spells of anger are examples of inflated states. The attempt to force and coerce one's environment is the predominant motivation in anger. It is a kind of Yahweh complex. The urge to vengeance is also identification with deity. At such times one might recall the injunction, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," i.e., not yours. The whole body of Greek tragedy depicts the fatal consequences when man takes the vengeance of God into his own hands. Power motivation of all kinds is symptomatic of inflation. Whenever one operates out of a power motive, omnipotence is implied. But omnipotence is an attribute only of God. Intellectual rigidity, which attempts to equate its own private truth or opinion with the universal truth, is also inflation. It is the assumption of his omniscience. Lust and all operations of the pure pleasure principle are likewise inflation. Any desire that considers its own fulfillment the central value transcends the reality limits of the ego and hence is assuming attributes of the transpersonal powers. Practically all of us, deep down, have a residue of inflation that is manifested as an illusion of immortality. There is scarcely anyone that is thoroughly and totally disidentified with this aspect of inflation. Hence, when one has a close call with death, it is often a very awakening experience. There suddenly comes a realization of how precious time is just because it is limited. Such an experience not uncommonly gives us a whole new orientation to life, making one more productive and more humanly related. It can initiate a new leap forward in one's development, because an area of ego self-identity has been dissolved, releasing a new quantity of psychic energy for consciousness. There is also negative inflation. This can be described as identification with the divine victim, an excessive, unbounded sense of guilt and suffering. We see this in cases of melancholia, which express the feeling that no one in the world is as guilty as I am. This is just too much guilt. In fact, taking on oneself too much of anything is indicative of inflation because it transcends proper human limits. Too much humility as well as too much arrogance, too much love and altruism as well as too much power striving and selfishness are all symptoms of inflation. States of animus and anima identification can also be seen as inflation. Arbitrary pronouncements of the animus are a deity talking, and so are the sullen resentments of the anima possessed man who says in effect, be what I tell you to be, or I will withdraw from you, and without my acceptance you will die. There is a whole philosophical system based on the state of ego self-identity. This system sees everything in the world as deriving from and relating to the individual ego. It is called solipsism, from solus ispe, myself alone. F. H. Bradley presents the viewpoint of solipsism in these words. I cannot transcend experience, and experience is my experience. From this it follows that nothing beyond myself exists, for what is experience is the self's state. Schiller defines solipsism rather more colorfully as the doctrine that all existence is experience and that there is only one experient. The solipsist thinks he is the one. 3. Adam and Prometheus. What follows the state of original inflation is presented vividly in mythology. An excellent example is the Garden of Eden myth, which significantly is called the Fall of Man. About this myth, Young writes, there is deep doctrine in the legend of the Fall. It is the expression of a dim presentiment that emancipation of ego consciousness was a Luciferian deed. Man's whole history consists from the very beginning in a conflict between his feeling of inferiority and his arrogance. According to the account in Genesis, God put man in the Garden of Eden, saying, quote, you may freely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die. Close quote. Then follows the creation of Eve from Adam's rib, and Eve's temptation by the serpent, who told her, you will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So Adam and Eve ate the fruit. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. God discovered their disobedience and put the curse upon them, following which are these significant words, quote, then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword, which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. Close quote. This is the myth which stands at the beginning of the Hebrew branch of our cultural tradition, and it is rich in psychological meaning. The Garden of Eden is comparable to the Greek myth of the Golden Age and Plato's original Round Man. The Garden of Eden has certain features of a mandala, with 4 rivers flowing from it, and the tree of life in its center. The mandala garden is an image of the self, in this case representing the ego's original oneness with nature and deity. It is the initial, unconscious animal state of being at one with oneself. It is paradisal because consciousness has not yet appeared, and hence there is no conflict. The ego is contained in the womb of the self. Another feature indicating original wholeness is the creation of Eve out of Adam. Clearly, Adam was originally hermaphroditic. Otherwise, a woman could not have been made from him. It is likely that here we have vestiges of an earlier myth in which the original man was definitely hermaphroditic. Undoubtedly, this earlier myth was modified by the one-sided patriarchal attitude of the Hebrews, which depreciated the feminine component of the psyche, reducing it to no more than a rib of Adam. Adam's separation into masculine and feminine components is a process which is parallel and equivalent to his separation from the paradise garden. In any case, the effect is that man becomes separated and alienated from his original wholeness. The drama of temptation and fall begins when the original state of passive inflation turns into the active inflation of a specific deed. The serpent's whole approach and appeal is expressed in inflationary terms. When you eat of this fruit, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God. So the fruit of the tree is eaten, and the inevitable consequences unfold. It all begins because Adam and Eve dare to act on their desire to be like God. The myth depicts the birth of consciousness as a crime which alienates man from God and from his original preconscious wholeness. The fruit is clearly symbolic of consciousness. It is the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which means that it brings awareness of the opposites, the specific feature of consciousness. Thus, according to this myth and theological doctrines that rest on it, consciousness is the original sin, the original Hubris, and the root cause of all evil in human nature. However, others have understood it differently. The Ophites, a Gnostic sect, worship the serpent. They had essentially the same view as modern psychology. To them, the serpent represented the spiritual principle symbolizing redemption from bondage to the demiurge that created the Garden of Eden and would keep man in ignorance. The serpent was considered good and Yahweh bad. Psychologically, the serpent is the principle of gnosis, knowledge or emergent consciousness. The serpent's temptation represents the urge to self-realization in man and symbolizes the principle of individuation. Some Gnostic sects even identified the serpent in the Garden of Eden with Christ. Eating the forbidden fruit marks the transition from the eternal state of unconscious oneness with the self, the mindless animal state, to a real, conscious life in space and time. In short, the myth symbolizes the birth of the ego. The effect of the birth process is to alienate the ego from its origins. It now moves into a world of suffering, conflict, and uncertainty. No wonder we are reluctant to take the step to greater consciousness. Another feature of the fall into consciousness is that Adam and Eve become aware of their nakedness. Sexuality and instincts in general suddenly become taboo and objects of shame. Consciousness is a spiritual principle, has created a counterpole to natural, instinctive animal function. Duality, dissociation, and repression have been born in the human psyche simultaneously with the birth of consciousness. This means simply that consciousness, in order to exist in its own right, must, initially at least, be antagonistic to the unconscious. This insight teaches us that all utopian psychological theories which assume that the human personality can be whole and healthy if only it is not subject to sexual and instinctual repressions in childhood are wrong. The innate and necessary stages of psychic development require a polarization of the opposites, conscious versus unconscious, spirit versus nature. But our survey of the myth of the fall is not complete if we leave it with the image of Adam and Eve, sadly taking up their hard life in the worlds of reality, earning their bread by the sweat of their brow and bringing forth children in pain. There were two trees in the Garden of Eden, not only the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but also the tree of life. And indeed Yahweh demonstrated some anxiety that man might discover the second tree and partake of its blessing. What can this mean? There is an interesting legend concerning the tree of life reported in Ginsberg's Legends of the Jews, which offers some insight on the question. In paradise stands the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, the latter forming a hedge about the former. Only he who has cleared a path for himself through the tree of knowledge can come close to the tree of life, which is so huge it would take a man 500 years to traverse a distance equal to the diameter of the trunk, and no less vast is the space and shaded by its crown of branches. From beneath flows forth the water that irrigates the whole earth. parting thence into four streams, the Ganges, the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Legends growing up around a myth often amplify and elaborate aspects left out in the original story, as though collective psyche needed to round out the picture and clarify the full symbolic meaning. Such, I think, is the case with the legend quoted. The biblical account gives a quite ambiguous picture concerning the relation between the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. This legend presents a much clearer and satisfying image. The legend presents the tree of life as an omphalos, or world navel, analogous to the world tree Yggdrasil. The Bible tells us that the fruit of the tree of life conveys immortality. Adam and Eve were immortal before the fall, but they were also unconscious. If they can eat the fruit of the tree of life after the fall, they have achieved both consciousness and immortality. Yahweh is opposed to any such infringement on his realm, and sets up the cherubim with the flaming sword as an obstacle. However, the Jewish legend quoted gives us some hint as to how the tree of life can be found. It can be reached by clearing a path through the hedge-like tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That is, one must repeatedly accept the temptation of the serpent, repeatedly eat the fruit of knowledge, and in that way eat his way through to the tree of life. In other words, the recovery of our lost wholeness can only be achieved by tasting and assimilating the fruits of consciousness to the full. The myth of the fall expresses a pattern and a process not just of the original birth of consciousness out of the unconscious, but also of the process that one goes through in one form or another with every new increment of consciousness. I believe with the Ophites that it is one-sided to depict Adam and Eve just as the shameful orchid thieves. Their action could equally be described as a heroic one. They sacrificed the passive comfort of obedience for greater consciousness. The serpent does indeed prove to be a benefactor in the long run, if we grant consciousness a greater value than comfort. We see fragments of this theme of the original fall of man in a good many dreams in the course of analytical treatment. They are very common at times when new conscious insights are being born. The theme of encountering or being bitten by a snake is common in dreams. The latter generally has the same meaning that the succumbing to the temptation of the serpent in the Garden of Eden had for Adam and Eve. Namely, an old state of affairs is being lost and a new conscious insight is being born. This is often experienced as something alien and dangerous, hence it is never a pleasant dream. But at the same time, such a bite usually initiates a whole new attitude and orientation. It is generally a transition dream of considerable importance. Also, dreams of having committed a crime may have the same meaning as the original crime of stealing the fruit. What is a crime at one stage of psychological development is lawful at another, and one cannot reach a new stage of psychological development without daring to challenge the code of the old stage. Hence, every new step is experienced as a crime and is accompanied by guilt, because the old standards, the old way of being, have not yet been transcended. So the first step carries the feeling of being a criminal. Dreams of being given fruit to eat, apples, cherries, tomatoes, may have the same meaning. They are allusions to the theme of eating the forbidden fruit, and represent an introduction to a new area of conscious awareness with much the same consequences as the original eating of the fruit. The following is an example of a modern dream that strikes the old theme of the temptation in the Garden of Eden. It was dreamt by a man in his forties. He first came to see me with the complaint of writer's block and anxiety attacks. He was a talented man, filled with creative ideas and inspirations. He could have the most amazing dreams, complete plays down to the last detail of costume and music, exit and entrance, but he could never get himself to do the hard work of putting them down on paper. It seemed as though the dream itself was adequate reality, as though just the fact that he could have magnificent compositions in fantasy were sufficient reality to relieve him of any sense of obligation to realize them in fact. Such an attitude is an identification with the original unconscious wholeness, the provisional life, which avoids the hard work required to make the potential actual. Although he thought he wanted to write, fantasies were unconsciously considered a sufficient reality in themselves. Such a person is afraid to make the commitment required to create something real. He would lose the security of anonymity and expose himself to disapproval. He is afraid to submit himself to judgment by being something definite. This amounts to living in the Garden of Eden state and not daring to eat the fruit of consciousness. Here is his dream. I am in a setting atmosphere that reminds me of Kierkegaard. I go into a bookstore looking for a particular book. I find it, and I buy it. The title is A Man Among Thorns. Then the scene changes. My sister has made an immense black chocolate cake. It is covered with a thin covering of red icing that looks like red tights. Although chocolate has always been forbidden to me because I am allergic to it, I eat the cake without bad effects. Some of the dreamer's associations were the following. He saw Kierkegaard as a troubled figure, a man in conflict between antitheses, particularly the conflict between aesthetic and religious attitudes. His book, Either Or, represents the whole problem of opposites. The book title, Man Among Thorns, reminded the dreamer of Christ and his crown of thorns. About chocolate cake, the dreamer said he always considered it poison because it would make him sick. Red icing like red tights reminded him of something the devil might wear. This dream, although expressed in modern and personal imagery, has a close parallel with the ancient myth of Adam's fall from paradise. On the basis of this archetypal parallel, we can hypothesize that it represents a potential transition in this man's personal development. The most striking feature of the dream is the eating of the cake. It is black and has a red covering which associates the devil. Black, as the antithesis of white, carries the implications of evil and darkness. In the dreamer's case, the chocolate cake was considered poison, indicating his conscious fear of the unconscious. To eat this poison cake is symbolically equivalent to being bitten by a serpent or eating the forbidden fruit. The consequence is the awareness of the opposites, knowing good and evil, and this means being thrown into a state of conscious conflict. With each new increment of consciousness, conflict comes too. This is how a new piece of consciousness announces its presence by conflict. Although the dreamer states that he ate the cake without ill effects, the consequences are presented symbolically in the first dream scene. It does not matter that the scene preceded the eating of the cake. Temporal sequence and causality do not apply in dreams. When a dream has several scenes, they can usually be best understood as varying ways to describe the same central idea. In other words, the stream of images in dreams circumambulates certain nodal centers rather than proceeding in a straight line as does rational thinking. Thus, being in a Kierkegaardian atmosphere and buying a book called A Man Among Thrones is only a symbolic variant of the image of eating a poisonous black cake. To eat the cake means to enter the Kierkegaardian experience of conflict and to understand the man among thorns, either Christ, who endured the most extreme tension of opposites by being both God and man, or Adam, who on being expelled from the garden was obliged to till the ground that brought forth thorns and thistles. What did this dream mean practically for the dreamer? It led to no sudden insight or change. He was not aware of being different after the dream, but her discussion of it, together with the subsequent dreams, did pave the way for a progressive increase in consciousness. When this patient first entered psychotherapy, he had symptoms but no conflict. Gradually, the symptoms went away and were replaced by conscious awareness of conflict within himself. He came to see that he didn't write because part of him didn't want to write. He came to realize that his anxiety was not a meaningless symptom, but a dangerous signal trying to warn him that his prolonged residence in the Garden of Eden might have fatal psychological consequences. As the dream suggested, it was time to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and accept the inevitable conflicts of being a conscious individual. And this transition is not all pain and suffering. The myth is one-sided here. The paradise state, too long persisted in, becomes a prison, and expulsion is then no longer experienced as an undesirable, but as a release. In Greek mythology, there is a parallel to the Garden of Eden drama. I refer to the myth of Prometheus. In a simplified outline, it runs as follows. Prometheus presided over the procedure of dividing the meat of sacrificial victims between gods and men. Previously, there had been no need for division because gods and men ate together, ego and self-identity. Prometheus tricked Zeus by offering him only the bones of the animal covered by a layer of enticing fat. For man, he reserved all the edible meat. Zeus, angered by the trickery, withheld fire from man. But Prometheus slipped into heaven, stole the fire of the gods, and gave it to mankind. In punishment for this crime, Prometheus was chained to a rock, where every day a vulture tore at his liver, and every night it was healed again. Punishment was also sent to his brother Epimetheus. Zeus fashioned a woman, Pandora, whom he sent to Epimetheus with a box. From Pandora's box emerged all the ills and sufferings that plague mankind: old age, labor, sickness, vice, and passion. The process of dividing the meat of the sacrificial animal between the gods and men represents the separation of the ego from the archetypal self, or psyche. The ego, to establish itself as an autonomous entity, must appropriate the food, energy, for itself. The stealing of the fire is an analogous image for the same process. Prometheus is the Luciferian figure whose daring initiates ego development at the price of suffering. Considering Prometheus and Epimetheus as two aspects of the same image, we can note many parallels between the myths of Prometheus and the Garden of Eden. Zeus withholds fire, Yahweh withholds the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Both the fire and the fruit symbolize consciousness, which leads to a measure of human autonomy and independence from God. Just as Prometheus steals the fire, so and Adam steal the fruit in disobedience to God. In each case, a willful act is committed against the reigning authority. The willful act is the grasping for consciousness, which is symbolized in each myth as a crime followed by a punishment. Prometheus is cursed with an unhealing wound, and Epimetheus is cursed by Pandora and all the contents of her box. The unhealing wound is analogous to the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, which is also a kind of wound. The pain, labor, and suffering that Pandora released are parallel to the labor, suffering, and death that Adam and Eve met after they left the Garden of Eden. This all refers to the inevitable consequences of becoming conscious. Pain and suffering and death do exist prior to the birth of consciousness, but if there is no consciousness to experience them, they do not exist psychologically. Distress is nullified if consciousness is not present to realize it. This explains the tremendous nostalgia for the original unconscious state. In that state, one is freed from all the suffering and consciousness inevitably brings. The fact that Prometheus's liver is eaten by the vulture during the day and restored at night conveys a significant insight. The day is a time of light, consciousness. The night is darkness, unconsciousness. Each one of us at night returns to that original wholeness out of which we were born, and this is healing. It is as though the wounding influence is not active. This indicates the consciousness itself as the wound producer. The eternally unhealed wound of Prometheus symbolizes the consequences of the break in the original unconscious wholeness, the alienation from the original unity. It is the constant thorn in the flesh. These two myths say essentially the same thing because they are expressing the archetypal reality of the psyche in its course of development. The acquisition of consciousness is a crime, an act of hubris, against the powers that be, but it is a necessary crime, leading to a necessary alienation from the natural unconscious state of wholeness. If we are going to hold any loyalty to the development of consciousness, we must consider it a necessary crime. It is better to be conscious than to remain in the animal state, but in order to emerge at all, the ego is obliged to set itself up against the unconscious out of which it came, and assert its relative autonomy by an inflated act. There are several different levels on which we can apply this understanding. On the deepest level, it is a crime against the universal powers, the powers of nature, or God. But actually, in everyday life, it is generally not experienced in such religious categories, but in quite personal ways. On the personal level, the act of daring to acquire a new consciousness is experienced as a crime or rebellion against the authorities that exist in one's personal environment, against one's parents, and later against one's other outer authorities. Any step in individuation is experienced as a crime against the collective, because it challenges the individual's identification with some representative of the collective, whether it be family, party, church, or nation. At the same time, each step, since it is truly an inflated act, is not only accompanied by guilt, but also runs the very risk that one will get caught in an inflation that carries the consequences of a fall. We encounter many people in psychotherapy whose development has been arrested just at that point where the necessary crime needs to be enacted. Some say, quote, "I can't disappoint my parents or my family." Close quote. The man living with his mother says, "I would like to marry, but that would kill poor old mother." And it might do just that because of the symbiotic relationship that may exist can be a literal kind of psychic feeding. If the food is withdrawn, the partner may well die. In such a case, obligations to the mother are seen too strong to envisage any other set of standards for living. The sense of responsibility towards one's own individual development has simply not yet been born. We see the same theme operating at times in the psychotherapeutic relationship. Perhaps a negative or rebellious reaction has emerged towards the analyst. Such a reaction may be accompanied by a great deal of guilt and anxiety, particularly if the analyst is carrying the projection of archetypal authority to express a negative reaction with genuine effect in these circumstances is felt to be very familiar in the crime against the gods. It will seem to be a dangerous act of inflation to it will seem to be a dangerous act of inflation certain to bring retribution. But at some point, unless the forbidden fruit is eaten, unless one dares to steal the fire from the gods, he will remain stuck in a dependent transference, and development will not proceed. 4. Hubris and nemesis. There are many other myths that depict the state of inflation, for instance, the myth of Icarus. Daedalus and his son Icarus were imprisoned in Crete. The father made them each a pair of wings, and with these they were able to escape. But Daedalus warned his son, "Don't fly too high, or the sun will melt the wax on your wings, and you will fall. Follow me closely. Do not set your own course." But Icarus became so exhilarated by his ability to fly, he forgot the warning and did follow his own course. He went too high, the wax melted, and he fell into the sea. In this myth, the dangerous aspect of inflation is emphasized. Although there are times when an inflated act is necessary to achieve a new level of consciousness, there are other times when it is foolhardy and disastrous. One cannot presume to set his own course safely until he knows what he is doing. Dependence on the superior wisdom of others is often an accurate appraisal of the realities of the situation. As Nietzsche said, "Many a one hath cast away his final worth when he hath cast away his servitude." I have spoken of a necessary crime of inflation, but it is a real crime and does involve real consequences. If one misjudges the situation, he suffers the fate of Icarus. I think that all dreams of flying have some allusion to the myth of Icarus. This is particularly true of the dreams of flight without any means of mechanical support. When one is off the ground, the danger is that he may fall. Abrupt impact with reality, symbolized by the earth, may be dangerously jarring. Dreams are symptom images of airplanes crashing, falling from high places, phobic fear of heights, etc., all derived from the basic psychic setup represented by the myth of Icarus. The following is an example of an Icarus dream. It was dreamt by a young man who was identified with a famous relative. He had borrowed wings constructed by another man and flew with them. I was with people at the edge of the high cliff. People were diving off into very shallow water below, and I was sure they would be killed. While still in the dream, or immediately upon waking, I thought immediately of Bruegel's painting, The Fall of Icarus. Bruegel's Fall of Icarus is a painting of the Italian countryside. On the left, farmers are plowing and going about their business. On the right is the sea with a few boats. In the lower corner one sees the legs of Icarus as he is disappearing into the water. One of the significant features of the painting is that the fate of Icarus on the right side is completely neglected by the figures on the left side, who are not aware that an archetypal happening is being presented before their eyes. The dreamer commented on this aspect of the painting, and it suggests that he himself is unconscious of the significance of what is happening to him. He was in the process of a fall from the heights of unreality, but this insight dawned on him only later. Another example of an Icarus dream is the following, dreamed by a woman. I am traveling along a road and see a man, like Icarus, in the sky. He is holding up a torch. Suddenly his wings catch fire and everything flames up. Fire engines on the ground train their hoses on him and manage to put out the fire, but he falls heavily to his death. Still holding up the torch, I see him land near me, and am horrified, cry out, "O God! O God!" The dreamer was a victim of frequent, intense, idealistic animus projections. This dream marked the death of such a projection, which had lured her into an inflated attitude about herself. Another myth pertaining to inflation is the myth of Phaeton. Phaeton was told by his mother that his father was Helios, the sun god. In order to prove this to himself, he traveled to the place of the sun and asked Helios, "Are you in fact my father?" Helios assured him that he was, and made the mistake of saying, "To prove it, I will give you whatever you ask for." Phaeton asked to be permitted to drive the sun chariot across the sky. Immediately Helios regretted his rash promise, but Phaeton insisted, and against his better judgment his father gave in. Phaeton drove the sun chariot, but because the task was quite beyond the youth's capacities, he crashed in flaming ruins. Again, the myth tells us that inflation has, as its inevitable consequence, a fall. Phaeton is the prototype of the modern hot rodder, and perhaps the myth has something to say also to the indulgent father who against his better judgment puts too much power too soon in the hands of his son, whether it be the family car or excessive rights of self-determination, before it is balanced by an equal sense of responsibility. I recall a patient with a Phaeton complex. The initial impression he gave was that of a jaunty, cavalier attitude. The rules followed by others did not apply to him. He had a weak father whom he did not respect, and consistently belittled or ridiculed figures who were in authority over him. He had several dreams of being in high places. In the course of discussing one of these dreams, the therapist told him the myth of Phaeton. For the first time in psychotherapy, the patient was profoundly moved. He had never heard the myth before, but immediately recognized it as his myth. He saw his life depicted in the myth and suddenly realized the archetypal drama which he had been living. However, all mythical images are ambiguous. We can never be certain in advance whether to interpret them positively or negatively. For instance, here is a positive Phaeton dream dreamt by the same man who had the chocolate cake dream. He had this dream that the night before, a most significant experience in which for the first time he was able to assert himself effectively against an arbitrary and intimidating authority figure at his place of work. If this dream had happened after the event, we might consider that it was caused by the outer experience. But since the dream came first, and the courageous encounter second, we are justified in thinking that the dream caused the outer happening, or at least created the psychological attitude that made it possible. Here is the dream. I am Phaeton, and I have just succeeded in driving the sun chariot across the sky. It is a magnificent scene, brilliant blue sky and white clouds. I have a feeling of intense joy and accomplishment. My very first thought was, Jung was so right about the archetypes after all. Here the myth of Phaeton is incorporated into the dream, but is changed to suit the dream's purposes. The dreamer Phaeton succeeds with where the mythical Phaeton had failed. Obviously the dreamer was taking a step that was not beyond his powers. What he was doing is risky. It does involve some measure of inflation. However, coming after the prior dream, I understand it to refer to a necessary, heroic inflation that will relate the dreamer to a new level of effectiveness within himself, as indeed it did. It is surely evident by now that the whole question of inflation is an ambiguous one. On the one hand it is risky, and on the other hand quite necessary. Which aspect should be emphasized depends on the individual and the particular situation he is in. Another myth of inflation is the myth of Axion. Axion's inflated act was his attempt to seduce Hera. Zeus foiled the attempt by shaping a cloud into a false Hera, with whom Axion took his pleasure. Zeus surprised him in the act and punished him by binding him to a fiery wheel that revolved endlessly through the sky. In this case, inflation manifested itself in lust and pleasure-seeking. Axion, representing the inflated ego, attempts to appropriate to itself that which belongs to the superpersonal powers. The attempt is doomed before it starts. The most with which Axion is able to make contact is only a cloud Hera, a fantasy. His punishment, being bound to a fiery wheel, represents quite an interesting idea. The wheel is basically a mandala. It connotes the self and the wholeness pertaining to the self, but in this case is transformed into an instrument of torture. This represents what can happen when the ego's identification with the self lasts too long. The identification then becomes torture, and the fiery passions of the instincts become a hellfire binding one to the wheel, until the ego is able to separate from the self and to see its instinctual energy as a supra-personal dynamism. So long as the ego considers instinctive energy its personal pleasure, he remains bound to Axion's fiery wheel. The Greeks had a tremendous fear of what they called Hubris. In original usage, the term meant wanton violence, or passion arising from pride. It is synonymous with one aspect of what I am calling inflation. Hubris is the human arrogance that appropriates to man what belongs to the gods. It is transcending of proper human limits. Gilbert Murray puts it well. There are unseen barriers which a man whose eidos, reverence, in him does not wish to pass. Hybris passes them all. Hybris does not see the poor man or the exile that has come from Zeus. Hybris is the insolence of irreverence, the brutality of strength. In one form it is a sin of low and weak irreverence, the absence of eidos in the presence of something higher, but nearly always it is a sin of the strong and proud. It is born of choros, or satiety, of being too well off. It spurns the weak and helpless out of its path, spurns, as Aeschylus says, the great altar of Dike, and Hybris is the typical sin condemned by early Greece. Other sins, except some connected with definite religious taboos and some derived from words meaning ugly or unfitting, seem nearly all to be forms or derivatives of Hybris. Murray considers eidos and nemesis to be central concepts of the emotional experience to the Greeks. Eidos means reverence from the supra-personal powers and also the feeling of shame when these powers have been transgressed. Nemesis is the reaction provoked by a lack of eidos, i.e. hybris. A good example of the Greeks' fear of going beyond reasonable human limits is presented in the story of Polycrates, recorded by Herodotus. Polycrates was the tyrant of Samos in the 6th century BC. He was an incredibly successful man. Everything he did worked out perfectly for him. His good luck seemed infallible. Herodotus writes, "The exceeding good fortune of Polycrates did not escape the notice of Amasis, his friend, the king of Egypt, who was much disturbed thereat. When therefore his successes continued increasing, Amasis wrote him the following letter and sent it to Samos. Amasis to Polycrates speak thus: It is a pleasure to hear of a friend and ally prospering, but your exceeding prosperity does not cause me joy, for as much as I know that the gods are envious. My wish for myself, and for those whom I love, is, to be now successful, and now to meet with a check. Thus passing through life amid alternate good and ill, rather than with perpetual good fortune. For never yet did I hear to tell of anyone succeeding in all his undertakings, who did not meet with calamity at last, and come to utter ruin. Now therefore give ear to my words, and meet your good luck in this way. Think which of all your treasures you value most and can least bear to part with. Take it, whatsoever it be, and throw it away, so that it may be sure never to come any more into the sight of man. Then, if your good fortune be not thenceforth checkered with ill, save yourself from harm by again doing as I have counselled. Polycrates took his advice and threw a treasured emerald ring into the sea. However, a few days later, a fisherman caught so large a beautiful fish that he thought he could not sell it, but must present it as a gift to King Polycrates. When the fish was opened, in its belly lay the emerald ring which the king had thrown away. When Amasis heard of this development, it so frightened him that he terminated his friendship with Polycrates, fearing he, Amasis, might be involved in the ultimate disaster that was sure to follow such uncanny good fortune. Sure enough, Polycrates eventually died by crucifixion following a successful uprising and rebellion. The fear of excess in good future is deeply ingrained in man. There is an instinctive sense that the gods envy human success. Psychologically, this means that conscious personality may not go too far without taking the unconscious into account. The fear of God's envy is a dim realization that inflation will be checked. Limits do exist in the nature of things and in the nature of the psychic structure itself. Of course, sometimes the fear of God's envy can be carried to quite excessive extremes. Certain individuals dare not accept any success or positive happening for fear that it will lead to some obscure punishment. As a rule, this seems to be the result of adverse childhood conditioning. Accordingly, it needs re-evaluation. But beyond this personal conditioning, there is an archetypal reality involved. Everything that goes up must come down. Oscar Wilde once said, quote, "There is only one thing worse than not getting what you want, and that is getting it." Close quote. Polycrates would be an example of that. Emerson expressed the same idea. He discussed it in his essay Compensation, which is a literary exposition of the theory which Jung later developed concerning the compensatory relation between the conscious and the unconscious. Here are a few passages from that essay. Emerson had been describing how every happening for good or ill has its compensation somewhere in the nature of things. He continues, "A wise man will extend this lesson to all parts of life, and know that it is part of prudence to face every claimant and pay every just demand on your time, your talents, or your heart. Always pay. For, first or last, you must pay your entire debt. Persons and events may stand for a time between you and justice, but it is only postponement. You must pay at last your own debt. If you are wise, you will dread a prosperity which only loads you with more. For every benefit which you receive, a tax is levied. The terror of cloudless noon, the emerald of Polycrates, the awe of prosperity, the instinct which leads every generous soul to impose on itself of a noble asceticism and vicarious virtue, are the tremblings of the balance of justice through the heart and mind of man." We find further expressions of the idea of inflation in the Hebrew and Christian theological concepts of sin. The concept of sin in Hebrew scriptures apparently grew out of taboo psychology. That which is taboo is considered unclean, but it also has the additional implication of being sacred, holy, and charged with an excess of dangerous energy. Initially, sin was the breach of a taboo, touching something that should not be touched because the tabooed object carried supra-personality energies. To touch or to appropriate such an object was a danger to the ego because it was transcending the proper human limits. Hence taboo can be seen as a protection against inflation. Later the taboo idea was reformulated in terms of God's will and the inevitability of punishment if his will is transgressed. But the idea of taboo and the fear of inflation still lurks behind the new formulation. Christianity also practically equates sin with inflation of the ego. The Beatitudes approach psychologically can be best understood as praise of the non-inflated ego. In Christian theology, the concept of sin as inflation is beautifully presented by Augustine. In his Confessions, he gives a vivid description of the nature of inflation. Recollecting his motivations as a child for stealing fruit from a neighbor's pear tree, he records that he did not want the pears themselves, but rather he enjoyed the sin in itself, namely, the feeling of omnipotence. He then goes on to describe the nature of sin as the imitation of deity. For so doth pride imitate exaltedness, whereas thou alone art God, exalted over all. Ambition, what seeks it, but honours and glory? Whereas thou alone art to be honoured above all, and glorious for evermore. The cruelty of the great would fain be feared, but who is to be feared but God alone? Curiosity makes semblance of a desire of knowledge, whereas thou supremely knowest all. Sloth would be fain to be at rest. But what stable rest besides the Lord? Luxury affects to be called plenty and abundance, but thou art the fullness, never failing plenitudes of incorruptible pleasures. Covetousness would possess many things, and thou possessest all things. Envy disputes for excellence. What more excellent than thou? Anger seeks revenge. Who revenges more justly than thou? Grief pines away for things, lost the delight of its desires, because it would have nothing taken from it, as nothing can from thee. Thus all pervertedly imitates thee, who remove far from thee, and lift themselves up against thee. Souls in their very sins seek but a sort of likeness of God. The same idea of inflation is implicit in Buddhist notion of avidya, not knowing or unconsciousness. According to the Buddhist view, human suffering is caused by personal craving and desirousness stemming from ignorance of reality. The state of affairs is represented pictorially by the image of a man bound to the wheel of life, which is turned by the pig, the cock, and the snake, representing the various forms of concupiscence. The Indian wheel of life is paralleled by Iaxion's revolving wheel of fire. Both signify the suffering which accompanies the ego's identification with the self, and the former attempts to appropriate for personal use the transpersonal energies of the latter. The wheel is the self, the state of wholeness, but is a torture wheel so long as the ego remains unconsciously identified with it. Various states of inflation due to residual ego self-identity are commonplaces of psychotherapeutic practice. Grandiose and unrealistic attitudes and assumptions of all kinds emerge as the therapeutic process uncovers the unconscious background. It is to these infantile, omnipotent assumptions that the theories and techniques of Freud and Adler have given almost exclusive attention. The reductive methods of these approaches is valid in dealing with the symptoms of ego self-identity. Although even here one must never forget the need to maintain the ego self-axis. The reductive method is experienced as a criticism and depreciation by the patient, and indeed those features are objectively present. An interpretation which reduces a psychic content to its infantile sources is a rejection of its conscious and evident meaning, and hence causes the patient to feel belittled and rejected. This method may be necessary to promote ego self-separation, but it is a sharp sword to be used with care. The purpose is to deflate, and it is this underlying purpose that it is given expression in vernacular speech when the psychiatrist is called a head shrinker. To those who resent the reductive method, even when used judiciously, I would cite the words of Lao Tzu. He who feels punctured must once have been a bubble. He who feels unarmed must have carried arms. He who feels belittled must have been consequential. He who feels deprived must have had privilege.